The NFL draft has come and gone, and we are going to recap the drafts from the teams from the AFC East tonight on the Draft Beard podcast. Hey guys, welcome into tonight's episode of the Draft Beard podcast. I am your host, Joshua Klein. So thank you guys so much for joining me. Then we are going to be recapping the drafts of the teams from the AFC East. So we'll go over the Patriots, the Bills, the Miami Dolphins, and the New York Jets. But before we do that, if you could do me a favor, if you could hit the like button, if you could like, subscribe, and share, I would really appreciate it. Doing all of those three things really helps spread the word about this podcast. It gets the content of this podcast to people who are all about the NFL draft, maybe just all things sports related. So if you could do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to my channel, and then hit that notification bell as well. And don't forget to share this with all your friends and family as well. So if you do hit that notification bell, that's going to let you know exactly when I drop an episode of the Draft Beard podcast. If you are a fan of my podcast, that you don't want to miss an episode, go ahead, hit that notification bell. I would really, really appreciate it. And thank you to all of those who've already subscribed to the podcast. I am really appreciative as well. So tonight we're going to recap the drafts and get some grades to some teams in the AFC East. And before we do that, I want to just give you a little recap or rundown of what you'll see on the screen as we go forward. So I have created a graphic there when we get to the teams that will show my big board, where that player fell on my big board. Additionally, I also put the consensus big board so you can kind of see the difference of where I had them versus the consensus. If you're not familiar with what the consensus big board is, that's just a composite of a lot of the bigger draft boards out there, and it kind of averages out where that player ranked. So if you see on that graphic a number that is in red, that just means that that player was ranked on the big board, either mine or the consensus, beyond to pick number 257. So there are 257 picks in this year's NFL draft. So they were red if they were ranked beyond that. And then if they are on the consensus big board and they are bolded, that means that they weren't ranked at all, meaning that they were well beyond ranked 480th player eligible for the 2025 NFL draft. I kind of did that to kind of make it even, since I only really looked at about 350 to 375 players this year. I basically just stopped at 258, and anybody beyond that, that's where their rank fell. So kind of didn't weight my value on the draft board too much. So that's just a brief explanation of what you'll see on the screen. So looking forward to getting into the AFC East here. And we'll get started tonight with the Buffalo Bills. So the Buffalo Bills draft class started out in the first round with staying at pick 30 and drafting Maxwell Harrison, the cornerback out of the University of Kentucky. I wasn't as high on Maxwell as a lot of the other draft pundits out there. I had him at 77 on my big board. The consensus had him at 39. So obviously that looks like much better value. I did think that Maxwell might be a sneaky guy to go in the first round. When I was doing my mock drafts with the Buffalo Bills, I did expect them to go corner or maybe defensive line. Those are the two positions I kind of thought that they would go, considering that that's where they had the most need. I really think that if some of those defensive linemen had fallen to them, that would have been a pick there, whether you saw Tyleik Williams. But the first round really saw the interior of the defensive line go really early. You had 5 of them picked before Buffalo picked. And so I think that moved their draft over to corner. So I think they shifted gears on the player that they were looking at. And so they went with Maxwell Harrison, the corner out of Kentucky. Now, one of the reasons I'm not a big fan of him, and I weight I should say, I like corners who are more man press, right? So if you have shown the ability in college to be a really effective or better at man press, you're going to get moved up the draft board. If you can tackle really well too, that's something I look at. So in Maxwell's game in college, it was in the scheme and the way he played, it was more of a zone fit. It's more of a projection to say that he's going to be a really good man press corner. The second thing that I don't really like in my corners when I'm looking, I just haven't seen throughout history, when you go and back test it, corners or wide receivers also in this case who are really, really thin, right? They're really thin frame. Think Emmanuel Forbes last year. Honestly, think Tank Dell. And part of the reason is the injury concern, right? Maxwell's very, very athletic. He's a hometown guy. I'm from the Detroit area. He's from Detroit. I know the Lions looked at him. A lot of other teams, had him in for their 30 visits. I just had him down farther on my draft boards for those reasons that I just mentioned. I had in my corner rankings, I had corners ahead of him. Obviously, the Travis Hunter, if you consider him a corner, but Will Johnson, Shahade Barron, Trey Amos, Siobhan Ravel, Benjamin Morrison, Azare Thomas, those types of guys. And I know Maxwell is more athletic. So if you're sitting there in the first round, all those defensive tackles went off the board. I would have rather have seen them go with a Trey Amos. I was much, much higher on Trey. Also sitting there in the first round, and you look at what went, they missed out. It's okay. You don't want to necessarily overreach. And they missed out on that defensive tackle run. Would have a Nick Emanwari fit better along, or a Trey Amos, as I've already mentioned. Would have been Donovan Ezeraku. Some of those that he went after. He was sitting there on the board. Would that have been a better player? A defensive, though I liked those players. And again, I will get to the second round pick here and TJ Sanders here in a second, but I think Trey Amos or someone like that would have been better value in my board. I understand I'm much different in rankings than Maxwell Hairston, and that's we all have different opinions, and some of us are going to be right and some of us are going to be wrong. But on my board, it was a big reach going for Maxwell. Then we come down into the second round, pick 41. And Buffalo drafts TJ Sanders out of South Carolina. There's another guy I wasn't very high on. If you look at my board, I had TJ Sanders at 99. He did make my top 100. He goes 41 overall. In my opinion, this is a really big reach. I wasn't a huge TJ Sanders fan. Part of the reason is I just didn't see from play to play the consistency that I wanted to see. I think that might come to conditioning. I didn't see the really good pad level, inconsistent anchor. I didn't see the run defense that I would like to see from him. I think his technique is really raw. So I didn't see a refined enough technique to have him rated as high as a lot of other players. Now, on the flip side of that, he is really a really good athlete. He's got plus length. He's got really good size. He gets upfield really quickly. He just needs refined technique. I see the potential there with TJ. I just looked at where the draft was going, and in that spot, I liked Alfred Collins much better. Donovan Ezeraku, again, was still on the board. You did take the corner, so now you come back here in the second round. I doubt they could have doubled up. I doubt that probably would have been a great game plan. You had Will Johnson still sitting on the board, but I liked Alfred Collins much more. I liked Nick Scorton more. I liked Donovan Ezeraku more than what they went. A receiver there would have been great. One of my favorite receivers in the draft, and Trey Harris. I think that would have been a great combination with Josh Allen, getting another guy with size in that offense. Jack Besh could have been a better player there. Mike Green, that he was on the board. Now I know why he fell. I just think there were a lot of other players with better value. I think they didn't reach in the first round for a defensive tackle. They didn't in the second round. I think they reached even comparative to the consensus big board. If you're going to go defensive tackle there, one of my favorite guys, a guy who had, I believe, round number 5 defensive tackle on my board, 5 or 6, and that was Darius Robinson out of the University of Toledo. That's a pick I would have liked a little bit better, but they ended up going with TJ Sanders. I think that's a reach, and I think they could have gotten better value. Then you come back down into the third round, and they did go defensive line again here, and they went with Landon Jackson, another guy not very high on at all. Consensus had him at 48. I had him at 88. Landon is a very, very good athlete. My issue with him is he doesn't display the athleticism in his game. He doesn't have very good bend. He is extremely, extremely stiff. He's got great size. He is a relentless worker, but I just didn't see in college what you saw in the pajama Olympics and the combine. They're just two totally different things, right? That height, weight, speed thing is great. It's great to have athletes, but at the same time, he's going to need a lot of coaching. I think he can come in and he's going to be a really good, exceptional edge setter on the run. He's got that. That's a high floor for him. The ceiling is there if he can learn to develop some pass rush. But again, he's just so stiff. He's one of the most stiff defensive linemen I remember seeing in a long time. Not a very good bend at all. Doesn't have as many pass rush moves as I would have hoped to have seen. He has the athletic ability. He's that freak of an athlete that you would think would be deserving of a first round type athleticism, but it's really third, fourth round graded production in college, in third or fourth, maybe third, fourth, fifth round grade in what he actually has in pass rush skills. I think taking a flyer on him at the third round, if you understand that, hey, at worst case scenario, you are going to get a guy who's going to set the edge for you. He can be, a two down a defensive end for you. If you can understand that that's what you're getting, that's fantastic in the third round. It's a slight reach. I think this is a better spot for Landon than what we saw in a lot of mocks where people were talking about maybe he would come in into the second round, early second round, late first round. This is a much better spot. Then we come back down into the fourth round at pick 109, and they go with Deion Walker. Again, another player I was definitely not as high on. I had it 178. The consensus had it at 91. Again, this is a big, beefy athlete, but unfortunately, and maybe it's due to injury, it did come out in the draft process that he was playing with a really bad back, and that specific injury that was kind of mentioned, that could cause really bad long-term ramifications. And can that player, if that's the injury that he was said to have had, that specific injury, it's concerning with it. So one of the reasons, that's a big reason, honestly, I had him so far down my draft board, is that injury and that back. Is it going to be something that he is going to recover from and be able to show what he showed in his 2023 tape? Or is this going to be a long-term thing? Is he going to be a rotational defensive lineman? He's got all the size in the world. He's a really great athlete. Unfortunately, that size that allows offensive linemen to get up underneath his pads. I just didn't see it with Deion Walker. He's a physical specimen. If you can understand that maybe that's all you're getting is a guy who can come in and be a situational pass rusher, just a guy who's going to spell you and allow him to go full speed at limited amounts of time, then I think maybe you've got something there. Again, I had him at 178. I think that was a reach. According to the big board, though, the consensus big board, it looks like good value. So that was my thoughts on Deion Walker. So they did address the defensive line there. Then they come back in round 5 and they grab the Ohio State cornerback, Jordan Hancock, at pick 170. The consensus had him at 179. I didn't have him in my top 257. Again, if you're going to go corner there and you're sitting in the 5th round at pick 170, were there some other players that I would have liked to have seen there? They just missed out by one pick, and one of my sleepers and high ceiling guys in Za Frazier. So that's kind of unfortunate. I would have rather seen the other Ohio State corner, higher floor, lower ceiling, and Denzel Burke out of Ohio State. I know they already addressed the defensive line, but Tyler Barron from Miami went just a couple picks beyond that. Dorian Strong, the cornerback out of Virginia Tech, I had him rated much higher. I had a borderline late 3rd, early 4th round grade on Dorian Strong, and he went just a few picks beyond that. So I think there were some other players that I would rather seen in that situation. I drafted maybe Jalen Reed, the safety out of Penn State, also went behind there. So I just thought that there were better options there for Buffalo than taking Jordan Hancock, the corner out of Ohio State. Then you come back in the 5th round and in pick 173, and you get Jackson Hawes. Now, if you were looking for a receiving tight end, there were a lot of those in this draft, and a lot of those had already went. So I think this was a great spot if you wanted a blocking tight end. Jackson Hawes is by far the best one in this draft. So if that's what you're getting, and you know you're getting a tight end 2, tight end 3, you already have a good receiving tight end in Kincaid. So I think this is a really good pair up with Jackson Hawes here. I had him at 220 on my draft board. Again, it looks like a little bit of a reach, but it depends. This is a different type of player. There are very few of these who are so exceptional at this phase of the game, completely kind of understand it, not going to get him too bad. Then we come back down to the 6th round and pick 177, and this is really good exceptional value. I would have taken out Dorian Strong much earlier. I had him almost in my top 100 at 104 on my draft board. The consensus had him at 105. So tremendous value. If he would have been here instead of picking Jordan Hancock, and then Jordan Hancock maybe was picked here, I probably would have liked that a lot better. So it's a really good value in getting Dorian Strong here. I think he can develop into a pretty good corner. Now he's raw. He's going to need some development, but he was one of my guys who I really liked in this draft class and was definitely much higher on them. And then in round 6 at pick 206, you come in with the developmental offensive tackle and Chase Line out of UConn. A big, tall guy at 6'8", 304 pounds. I liked him a lot as a developmental tackle. He was one of the guys who, if you were looking for a developmental tackle in this class, he was one of them. Like a Cameron Williams, Chase Line, Jaden Travis, Holland Pierce were kind of my guys that if you were looking for a developmental tackle on day 3, those were some guys that I would have looked at. I had a 4th round grade on Chase Lunt. So they get pretty good value here. If you see on my board, I had him at 138, so we went 68 picks higher. He was 147 on the consensus. So they do get good value here in Dorian Strong and Chase Lunt. Then we came back with Caden Prather, the wide receiver out of Maryland. I think that could be a good pick. He didn't have as good a 2024 as I would have liked. I had him Caden and on my draft board. Not rated in my top 257. So I think at the 7th round, you get a guy with good size. He's got good weight. He's got doesn't have really great speed. So if you're looking for maybe a possession receiver who can go up, get contested catches, that's a guy I'm fine with taking a flyer there near almost the end of the draft. So overall, I think the Bills had some reaches in this draft based on where I had them in my draft board. Now, could they come out with some decent players in this draft? Sure. I think they're going to view Maxwell as a starter. I think they're going to view TJ Sanders as a starter. Same with Landon Jackson. They took a flyer on Jordan Walker. I think there's a lot of guys that are going to be, a wide variance. They're kind of low. They aren't low floor. So, sorry, they have low floors. They don't really have a high floor, and you're looking for the boomer bust. So I think they took a lot of boomer bust prospects in the top, 4 rounds of this draft. I think Jackson Hawes is going to, provide some value. So overall, with the Bills, my favorite pick in their draft class actually was Dorian Strong. I was really high on him. I had him in my top 13. Again, a borderline 3rd round, 4th round grade. Best value, Chase Lunt or Dorian Strong there late in the draft. My most puzzling pick was TJ Sanders. I get it. They missed out on some of the defensive linemen. They had him higher on their board. I think he's just too much of the same next to Ed Oliver in terms of trying to do play style. I think getting an Alfred Collins or maybe a Jamari Caldwell, somebody who can kind of play more of a nose, a bigger guy there probably would have been a better fit. But, they went with the athletic upside and TJ Sanders. So overall, I gave the Buffalo Bills a C grade in this draft. I think if you are a person who has had your draft board closer to the consensus, then your draft grade's definitely going to be a lot higher. Because if you look on my little chart there, I had them losing 202 picks of total value. Or on the flip side, the consensus is going to be that draft much more favorable than what I gave it. So overall, the Buffalo Bills, I gave them a solid C grade. So not one of my favorite classes in comparison to where I had players on the draft board. So we're going to move on down farther south into Miami, Florida, and we're going to talk about the Miami Dolphins draft class. And the Miami Dolphins didn't have a lot of picks. They traded some picks away. That left them with not very much draft capital in the top 3 or 4 rounds of this draft, which is kind of puzzling because Miami has a lot of holes on their roster. They had a lot of needs. And so in the first round, they did go with one of my favorite players in this draft, and that's Kenneth Grant out of the University of Michigan. I've watched him play for years. I think there is tremendous high upside with Kenneth Grant. I think at worst, you're going to get a very athletic, run-stopping defensive tackle with some limited pass rush, but I think he has all the ability in the world to be much more than that. I think he has Pro Bowl type potential. I had him as a second-round grade, borderline right there at the cutoff of my first round graded players. So I had him 17th overall on my board. Obviously, he goes 13th overall, 21st on the consensus. I had him as my second highest graded defensive tackle. And it was very apparent in this draft that the NFL viewed the defensive tackle class much higher than the edge class. So I think that's a good pick for Miami. Could have you seen them go with a Walter Nolan or a Derek Harmon? Sure. I think there's going to be some argument there. Now, cornerback could have been in play there, but again, with the way the draft fell and the concerns over Will Johnson, that kind of didn't play out. We'll maybe discuss that more when we get to their second round pick. So I think taking Kenneth Grant, they needed someone on the defensive line. I think that's a solid pick for them. I know it could be high risk, high reward for Miami. They have a lot of needs all over that roster. Edge, interior defensive line, safety, interior offensive line, offensive tackle, cornerback. They just have a lot of needs. I think safety there, that team is really thin at safety. Malachi Starks could have been great value. I know he went much later. But overall, I think Kenneth Grant getting picked there is a fine pick. I think he has high upside. So I think he fits perfectly in what they're going to try to do. So then you go into the second round and they pick Jonah Savaiinaea, the interior offensive line out of the University of Arizona. I view him more as a guard instead of a tackle. I know some people out there had graded Jonah as an offensive tackle. I had a 3rd round grade on Jonah. He was my 6th graded offensive tackle on my draft board, 72 overall on my big board, 55 on the consensus. So I think a little bit of a reach. Now, the problem is with as limited draft picks as the Miami Dolphins had with as many needs, they kind of had to pick what position they were going to go for. Maybe they went with the highest on the draft board. I think their defense is in rough shape. Safety is not a great spot on their roster. Neither is corner. I think if you're sitting there and in that spot, I think I would have rather seen them try to accumulate more draft picks instead of giving up draft picks. Now, granted, Nick Emanwari went just before they got Jonah at 37. You had really good corners there. There were players who were much higher on my draft board than Trey Amos. You had Will Johnson sitting there. You could have went with edge. You had Donovan Ezeraku and Mike Green and others who just were there. There were so many players that were much higher on my draft board and even the consensus draft board than taking Jonah Savaiinaea. You could have maybe moved down a little bit, got a Wyatt Milam, who ended up, I believe, going later in that second round, if I'm not second round or early 3rd round. Ozzie Tropilo, same thing. There are just so many better players to pick than Jonah Savaiinaea. Even though I like him, he's got some potential. And I see him more as a guard. I think he's versatile. He can play on both sides. He can play inside. He's athletic. I think he does have a high ceiling. So, I get it. I can understand the rationale needing to protect Tua, but I just might have went in a different position or tried to trade down instead of moving around the draft board and accumulated more picks in this draft because they really, really do have a lot of needs, and they have a very thin roster in Miami. So not something I would have done because that left them with no picks for over 100 picks later. Their next pick was not till round 5 at pick 143. And they got Jordan Phillips out of the University of Maryland. I had him at 127 on my board. Consensus had him hit 132. Like Jordan Phillips, I don't have really much to critique out of that one. He's got really good speed. His speed to power conversion is really good. He's a really good quality defensive lineman. He doesn't have really good pass rush arsenal, but I like him. I think that was a solid pick there. Double up on defensive line, a player who plays a little bit different than Kenneth Grant. They really did have a need there on the defensive line, and they did address that. They didn't get an edge rusher, but I think that's a fine pick there at 143. Got okay value. You come back down, you got a 5th round pick, 7 picks later, and that's pick 150. They pick up Jason Marshall, the cornerback out of the University of Florida. So I had him at 155, so kind of right there on the consensus big board, or sorry, on my big board. The consensus had him, rated beyond 257. They needed some secondary help. He's 6 foot 194. I think he can play on the outside. He's a pretty good athlete. He's decent ball skills. So again, they addressed corner. I think that's a nice little spot for Jason Marshall, the cornerback. I had Jason is my 15th rated corner. So I had players like Mac McWilliams, Denzel Burke, just ahead of him, just behind him, Zy Alexander, a little bit more size. It's the corner at LSU's Frazier. So, I'm not going to hit Miami too hard with that. I think I would have rather seen a corner taken instead of Jonas Savanaia. You come back 5 picks later, pick 5, 155. They got a safety, Dante Schrader Jr., the safety out of the University of Maryland. He's really good at ball skills, not a great tackler. And if you look at my big board, I had him at 175. Consensus had him at 232. If I look over at my safety rankings, I had Dante Schrader right behind players like Lathan Ransom and Craig Woodson. So again, that's a pretty solid pick there for them. They're going to get a ball hawking safety to help that safety room that is in desperate need of some help. I don't know who's going to win the starting battle there. He could compete with that. Then you come back at pick 179. You pick up Ali Gordon the second. So you already have quite a few running backs when Devin Achane and Raheem Mostert there in Miami. He's just another one to add to the room. I had him as at 190 on my big board, 145 consensus. Again, a player whose 2024 tape wasn't as good as at 2023. Getting a running back there in a deep running back class. Not the biggest need for Miami. Probably a bigger need at wide receiver. They did pick a safety. Would have there been a better defensive lineman or an edge rusher to take there? I mean, you're sitting there in the 6th round at pick 179. You're kind of nitpicking, who you're going to get there in round 5 there, or was it 6? Sorry. It's round 6. Sorry. In round 6. So I think it's worth a little bit of a flyer on Ali Gordon. He does have some potential there. You argue, looking at a little bit different player there, maybe, Kyle McCord went right behind there. So if you're looking for, taking a flyer on someone with Tua's injury concerns, I personally liked Devin Neal. I was much higher on Devin Neal than taking Ali Gordon, but I kind of understand it. You already did take a safety. Would have you doubled up there with Jalen Reed? So not going to hammer him too much with that pick. I don't think the value is like crazy off. Taking Ali Gordon there. They did end up going with the quarterback, the developmental. I would have rather seen a Kyle McCord or a Will Howard, not a Quinn Ewers fan. I did not have him ranked in my top 257. And then we come and we draft a 3rd defensive tackle in Zeke Biggers out of Georgia Tech, a guy who I didn't have in my top 257. He's 6'6", 320. He's going to be a run stuffing defensive lineman, a rotational piece there. I think you already had 2 defensive linemen. Maybe I would have rather seen somebody different. But again, you got 4 picks left in the draft. And at that point, you're just trying to grab someone that in the draft that you may not have been able to snag as a UDFA. So overall, I didn't really like the Dolphins draft at all. One of the more lackluster drafts in the entire draft. I gave them a D grade. I think their best pick, obviously, is Kenneth Grant. I think they got the best value out of getting Jordan Phillips out of Maryland. And I just was puzzled by the pick of Jonas Savaiinaea. I know they had to, they have a lot of needs. So, they did address one on the interior of the offensive line, but I think there were just far better players. Even if you just went BPA, there's so many needs. I could have totally rationalized that and getting BPA and said, they move around the draft board, get some picks next year. So that was a puzzling pick for me. And again, a D grade for the Miami Dolphins, one of my lowest grades in the entire NFL draft. They didn't have picks near the top of the draft where all the meat and potatoes was in that second into early fourth round. They kind of now have picks next year. So not a great draft by the Miami Dolphins. You're going to have Kenneth Grant, who's going to be a starter. You hope that Jonah can come in right away and be a starter. But that's my perception of the Miami Dolphins draft class. And next up, we're going to move to New York. And so we're going to discuss the New York Jets and their draft class. And they started off by taking Armand Membou, the tackle out of the University of Maryland. He was number 5 on my big board, number 7 overall. If I look at my tackle rankings here, I loved Armand Membou. I had him as my number 1 graded tackle. If you considered still Will Campbell a tackle, I still had him above that. I think he is a really good player, a lot of potential, really good athletic player. I think he's going to fit more on the right side than the left. Maybe you could try him at the left, but I do view him more as probably you just a plug and play, maybe 10-year starter at right tackle. He's going to have some bumps and bruises as you get him acclimated, but I really liked what the Jets stuck with, building on the interior, building on the trenches. They didn't go for Tet McMillan. They didn't go for a Tyler Warren. They didn't go with the flash. They stuck with trying to build the offensive line. So maybe down the road, when your offensive line is solidified and some of the other positions on your team and you're ready for that quarterback, you're going to have an offensive line that can protect them. So I think that was a really solid pick by the New York Jets. This is probably exactly what I would have done in that situation. I liked that pick a lot. And then we come into the second round and the Jets pick up Mason Taylor, the tight end out of LSU. I had him 64 in my draft board. The consensus had him 46. So a little bit of a reach for me. So in this case, instead of taking that tight end right away and using that top 7 pick on a guy like Tyler Warner or Colston Loveland, they come back and they get one later. He's a super young prospect. He's 6'5", 255 pounds. He's a really good pass catcher. I think of these groups of tight ends, the Harold Fannons, the Terrence Fergusons, the Elijah Aurora, I think he was the one with the most upside when it comes to blocking. He's not great at it right now. I think this was probably, if they wanted to go tight end, this is a good spot to grab one. I liked Mason Taylor. And a lot of other draft pundits might have been a little bit higher on him. Maybe, my critique, in that spot is taking a tight end that high when there was a lot of them. You could come back and say, hey, you had an edge rusher sitting there like Ezraku. If that's the direction you wanted to go, you'll be a direct comparison here because Terrence Ferguson just went after that. I think they could have looked at a Will Johnson here, but again, we're going to get to in a second, but they did come and address corner and a corner. I think that fits there. You had some edge rushers go right after that spot. You had some wide receivers go right there. So if you wanted to critique it, there were some players who were higher on my draft board. But again, I'll give them some credit for not taking that tight end in the first round, waiting to the second round, picking my next highest tight end. He was my 3rd tight end on my board. So he was the start of the next tier of tight ends after the big 2 in Loveland and Warren. So maybe I could nitpick there a little bit that the Jets could have went in a different direction with needs in other areas. But tight end was a need and receiver was a need there. So go with Mason Taylor. in the second round. They come back in the third round at pick 73. And here we go. Here's where they get the corner that I think just fits them really well. Fits what Aaron Glenn wants to do. Fits him like a glove. He's tall. He's lengthy. He's not fast. He didn't test well. But man alive, is he feisty and got really good man press coverage. If you know anything about Aaron Glenn and how he ran his defense in Detroit, loves guys who can tackle, loves guys who are great at man press. This is one of the best scheme fits that Azure could have found. Excellent pick there. I think they got really good value also based on where I had him in my draft board. I had him 39th overall. Consensus had him at 49. You get him at 73. I get it. Probably fell because of those speed concerns when athletic testing came out. Kind of get it. And then we come into the fourth round at pick 110. And here we go. This is where this draft was, kind of on a good trajectory. And it just goes completely off the rails, in my opinion, going with Arian Smith. I had him at 208 on my board. The consensus big board didn't have him rated. Listen, he isn't a speed demon. But however, can he actually catch the football? That's the issue here. And one of the things when I'm going grading wide receivers, one of my friends asked me, hey, what's one of the number one things you look for when you're evaluating wide receiver? Number one is drops. If they don't have sure hands, that is a huge red flag for me. Now, if they have, average hands, right? I would say that, you just need some coaching, but Arian is not displayed really that much of an ability at all. He has had some drops. He's got great juice, great speed. But you got to get him in space to utilize that speed. He's really got to be a wide open. He, again, just doesn't have great hands. There are much better options. I think if you wanted to go wide receiver, you're sitting there in the fourth round at 110 overall. And that's the receiver that you chose to go with. Is, for me, that was really, really surprising. I think some better options, went much later. If you wanted the speed guy, Jalen Lane's sitting right there. He went to pick 128 to the Commanders. I had Jalen Lane in my top 13. He was a third round grade for me. And obviously you saw Arian Smith was a borderline 6th, 7th round grade for me. If you wanted just better possession receivers, Jalen Royo is there. Alec Aomaner was sitting there. Again, if you want another speed guy, a guy liked a little bit better, was Jordan Watkins out of Ole Miss. I just think there are so many better options there at receiver, even a better position. I just think that is, not a great pick. And like I said, that's where the Jets draft just went, took a trajectory for the strange. They get back on track, though, in round 4, pick 130, a player I was much higher on in the consensus. I had him in my top 182. Consensus had him at 154. He is a player when I watched and read about, I just didn't understand why the draft community didn't just have him much higher. I just didn't understand it. He was a captain. He was a leader. I get he doesn't have elite skills, right? I think he's just an average tackler, average at coverage. He's just average across the board. I think he's going to be a solid safety at the NFL level. If you're just looking for a guy you can plug in and be a starting safety in the NFL, you just got a starter, in my opinion, at pick 130. Loved Malachi Moore. He's just super smart, really good IQ, great instincts. He's a guy who has really good man coverage and he tackles well. So I think there's a solid pick. Again, this just fits what Aaron Glenn's trying to do. So I think he did a good job at upgrading the cornerback room. The solid pick there at 198. And then you come back in round 5 at pick 162 to pick up Francisco Muaga, linebacker out of the University of Miami. He's really kind of a blitzer. Maybe they use him as like how Detroit used Ife Melifanu, who is a safety. I didn't have him rated in my top 257. Neither did the consensus big board. He's a situational guy. Again, I think they're just going to utilize in a specific role. Might I looked at a different area? Yeah, definitely would have looked at a different area than where they went there. And then the Jets come back with their last pick, and that's at pick 5, pick 176. And they get some value in getting Tyler Barron, the edge out of the University of Miami. Really good value, I think, there. He has good size. He moves well. I think he's going to be a guy who can maybe be a rotational defensive lineman to start out his career. I think he has some potential to be a starter in the NFL. If you look at where I had him at number 126. Consensus had him at 148. If you look at my rankings overall, I had him as a 4th round grade. I had him right around where Kyle Kennard, Savion Jones, Q Robinson, Elijah Roberts, those are all guys kind of similar in that tier. You get him in the 5th round, I think is really good value. So that pick, like that a lot. If I look at the draft class as a whole for the Jets, loved the Membu pick. He was my favorite pick. I think the best value they got was, Azare Thomas. Another one of my favorite picks is, as I discussed, is Malachi Moore. But then we get the Smith pick in the 4th round. That's just weird. It doesn't go with the mantra I would have thought Aaron Glenn would have went with. And again, to me, it's too much of an HWS height, weight, speed pick, not a film pick. That to me was the most puzzling. I did give the Jets a solid B+ grade in this draft. I think the good job building from the trenches, not reaching for the tight end. It's good when you look at a draft class as a whole and you look and you go, you still get your tight end, you still solidify the defensive line, you still got your secondary pieces. Just could have been an A draft without the Arian Smith and the Mwaga picks there. Those are the ones that were puzzling. But overall, I gave the New York Jets a solid B+ grade. Next up, we're going to head over to Foxborough and the New England Patriots. And so the New England Patriots had quite a few picks in this draft. They started out in round 1, 4th overall, and they took Will Campbell, the guard/tackle out of LSU. I think he's probably going to have a better career at guard there, and looks like they're going to try him at tackle. I had him at number 9 on my big board. Again, he wasn't my highest rated tackle in the draft, but I think it's a solid pick. Building through the trenches, picking a pick that will help Drake Maye and protect him. It's a solid pick there at 4th overall. I wonder how much activity they got in trying to move down. That might have been a little bit better of a situation where they pick up some more draft capital. But again, solid pick. Kind of expected. Most of the mock drafts kind of had Will Campbell penciled in there. So a good pick there by the New England Patriots. I think at worst case, I think you've got a fill-in, long-term, multiple contract starter at guard. Best case scenario, hey, maybe he can be that at tackle and just leave it all on the field and be that protector for Drake Maye. And it's worth the risk there to try to see if he can make it at tackle. But if not, you've got yourself a solid guard. And know that's probably a little rich for 4th overall if he does end up playing guard. And then again, looking at some of the other options that would have fit there, Abdul Carter's off the board. Mason Graham might have been an okay selection there. We've addressed a lot of that stuff in free agency. So good pick by Will Campbell going to the New England Patriots. You come in the 2nd round at pick 38, and running back, I think was just a little bit of a sneaky need for the New England Patriots. And boom, I think they get Travion Henderson. If you're going to go running back, I think that's a great pick. He's one of the best pass protectors in terms of the running backs in the entire class. He's got home run speed. I think that pairs well with who they already have in the roster. So that's a solid pick there. I had him on my draft board at pick 40. Overall, he goes 38. Consensus at 42. So again, you're kind of dead on with where the board had him. Then you come back in round 3 and you get a receiver that I know a lot of the draft media really liked. I liked him a lot as well. I had him as my number 11 wide receiver in this draft. He just missed my top 10. I had him behind Jalen Noel, Jalen Royals, Maynard, Luther Burden. I like Kyle Williams a lot. I think he's going to fit in well with what they already have on the roster. He's got a lot of speed, pretty good route running, not great route running. I think he's going to thrive well with New England. I think he's got just enough yards after the catch ability. Now he's smaller, right? He's not super small. He's 6 foot 186, so he's not tall. He's not a contested catch guy. But I think that's a pretty decent pick for a team that needed some receivers. I think that's going to play well for the New England Patriots. Now, my board had him at 65. He goes 69. Consensus was much lower at 95. So they're going to view that as a little bit more of a reach, but like that pick. Then we come into another pick in the third round at pick 95. I had a player named who was 85 in my board. That's Jared Wilson, the center out of the University of Georgia, the number one center by a country mile in this draft. Excellent, solid pick. Perfect pick there. I can't, I was surprised that Jared lasted this long. I thought because of the lack of, even really a draftable tier 2, really everybody else, if you viewed him as a center, were day 3, mid to late day 3 picks at best. So if you wanted a center, this was the guy that you wanted to target. They got the best center in the draft, and Jared Wilson. I think he has a really high ceiling. I think it's a great pick by New England. Fits right in with value. So far, they've done a really good job with their first 4 picks. Come into round 4, and at pick 106, I had him at 151. The big board had him at 188, and that's Craig Wilson, the safety out of Cal. I think that's a good pick. The closer we got to the draft, he's a really athletic safety. He is 6 foot, 200 pounds. He's pretty good athleticism. He doesn't miss tackles. I think honestly, when if I had a little bit more time to go through and re-evaluate a little bit where I had players ranked, he's one of those players that during the draft and after the draft, I probably said I probably had him ranked much lower than he probably should have been. In Craig Wilson, the safety out of Cal. I had him as a 5th round grade. Probably if I had some time to go back and look at it like I have after the draft, probably would have put him as a solid 4th round grade. But so I like the pick in Greg Woodson, the safety. I think there was a lot of people who had him as kind of their sleeper safety picks. That was a good pick as well. You come back, you get Joshua Farmer, the defensive tackle. I had him as 99 on my big board. He went 137. Again, another solid pick there. Can't really nitpick it. I think that's just great value looking at best player available. Round 5, pick 146. You got a guy who I absolutely loved. I had him at number 31 on my big board. He just kept climbing up the draft board for me throughout the process. Really liked that player. Now, granted, we learned some things during the draft or after the draft, why he was falling. But again, we aren't privy to that stuff. We only have X amount of information, and the NFL has a lot more information to work on. Sounds like he had some issues with coachability and some maturity issues. But what you look at on the field, I think to get an absolute steal in Braden Swinson, who I think can come in and, if given the right situation based on his ability, could be a starter in the NFL. I love that pick. That is exceptional value. And then in round 6 and 7, this is where we get a lot of players who I really didn't get a chance to watch. They took a special teams player, the kicker out of the University of Miami, and Andres Morales. I didn't have him ranked, and I really don't rank special teams players. Marcus Bryant, the tackle out of Missouri. I didn't get a chance to watch him. He was not ranked on my board. In round 7, they take a long snapper in Julian Ashby, and then a player that wasn't ranked on the consensus big board at all, and I didn't really know much about, and that's Kobe Minor, the defensive back out of the University of Memphis. So, looking at the back end of the draft in the 6th or 7th round, they took some reaches, just in my opinion. But again, there are players that I didn't really get a chance to watch, and I don't rank special teams guys. I think if you're going to draft a special teams player, we really should, like a kicker and a punter, round 5 into round 6 is probably the earliest that I would consider doing that. But overall, I think they hit, pretty much maybe some home runs with a lot of the picks, and from rounds 1 through 5. I really like that draft. My favorite pick for the New England Patriots was Travion Henderson. I think that's going to fit really well with what they're trying to do there. It's also going to help Drake Maye. So that was my favorite pick. Obviously, the best value that they got was Braden Swinson. And of course, the Patriots patriot a little bit by picking a long snapper in round 7. But again, that's right towards the very end of the draft, right? They had Kobe Minor. That was Mr. Irrelevant. Julian Ashby probably didn't want to wait to see if they could get him as a UDFA. So not going to hammer him too hard for that. So when your most puzzling pick is a pick that's almost near the very end of the draft, I say you'd had a pretty good draft. So I gave the Patriots an A grade overall, one of the better drafts in this entire draft class. So I think they ended up coming away with, you got a starter that's going to share right away at running back. I think you got a starting tackle to start in Will Campbell. If Jared Wilson wants to come in and earn the starting center job, I think you've got one there. I think, again, Kyle Williams is going to see the field a lot at receiver. And then watch out for, maybe by the end of the season, you see more snaps for guys like Joshua Farmer and Braden Swinton. So I think it was a really solid draft. That's an A draft by the New England Patriots. So one of the better drafts in the NFL. So with that, thank you guys so much for joining me on this AFC East recap and grades. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. I would really appreciate it. Looking forward to, some more episodes of the Draft Beard podcast. We're getting down there and finishing up my recap. So until next time, everyone, have a great night.
The Draft Beard podcast.